Calvin, thank you so much for joining us. What do you prefer, CJ?
CJ or Calvin?
Calvin.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you. I'll tell you. I could be wrong because still got 50 pages to go. But you plow through it. This thing is unbelievably well researched, unbelievably gripping. The kind of anecdotes you got, and there are many. I was telling Joe before the show, though, would we call it the feel-good event of the winter?
No.
No, it's not that. I was a whole bunch angry, a whole bunch sad. My mind was blown. But yes, I don't know. There's too much uplifting shit out there right now. She lives on Lifetime movies.
Can you start by just telling everyone, so the title of the book is a phrase that you use throughout the book. Tell us a little bit about what purgatory citizenship means.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you both for having me here.
Oh,
It's
man,
great.
thank you so much. I'm sorry it took so long. But I was blown away.
So I came up with the title because when I started doing the research for this book, I was working with a community-based reentry organization in Newark, New Jersey, which was kind of the field side of the book. And a lot of the conversations that were coming up was about how these folks' lives were really in a kind of limbo state. So they were no longer incarcerated, but there were all of these restrictions on their mobility, where they could go, where they could work, who they could live with. And so we were just having these conversations. And then obviously 2 big events happened during the time while I was doing the field work, which was one, the re-election of Barack Obama, as well as the murder of Trayvon Martin. So a lot of these guys were really wrestling with the fact that, they didn't really get much of a say-so in what their government was doing or feeling kind of left out. And so we started toying with this idea around citizenship and then the idea of limbo, and being a boy raised in the Catholic Church, going to Catholic school K through 12th grade, purgatory was always kind of on the mind. So I came up with this idea that there's really this kind of limbo status where they're not really in but not really out, and so that's how I came up with the title.
It's the perfect title, and it is absolutely the injustice that goes on with every single brutal, but page-turning anecdote. And also, just on a side note, it is so strange how many Catholics we have. Joe and I were both raised Catholic, and for whatever reason, even when guests don't know that we were raised Catholic, it always comes up.
There's a large, I think especially on the East Coast, there's a large population of Catholics.
Hey,
so I don't think it's that strange.
Yes.
But it is interesting how it does sort of influence
It
our
really
thinking
does, yeah.
Still, so.
You can see the guilt on us. Yeah. You see the eyes. Yeah.
It's like the more educated we get, we're like, what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll go all over the place because I got a million questions, as does she. But I guess. I'm told you're a woman, so we can start there because I was reading a portion of the book about this last night. You talked to a lot of sex workers, and there was a lot of accounts on that. Again, not uplifting, but very fascinating. I think the thing that stuck out with me was one woman you spoke with. It had gotten to the point she'd been busted a couple times, and the yin to the yang as far as the sex worker versus the client. At one point, the cop apologizes to the John while rearresting her. And as they also sadly would say, they don't get many tries when they go out. A guy is looked at as a tough guy when they come out, and they have no problem dating, but these women a little less so.
Sure, and I think a term that we want to talk about too is that a lot of these women were engaging in survival sex work, right? It wasn't that they were enjoying what they were doing, but as one woman, I think the woman that you're referring to talks about that she was basically doing this because she had a drug addiction, and that she was kind of cycling in and out of the jail system because of her addiction, that the courts had never really given her meaningful rehabilitation and or drug counseling and things of that nature. And so, like she said, I think she said something to the effect of, like, they're never going to give me life for sex work.
Yeah.
And then also, I think she had a really great critique of saying, like, judges, prosecutors, cops, they're all looking at porn. Why are they arresting me for the stuff that they go home and enjoy in the privacy of their home? I'm just trying to make a buck like anyone else.
Oh my God, yes. And then again, and then the flip side of that. There was another anecdote where there was this guy and his cousin, I believe, was gay, and they had some sort of racket where he would pick up someone for sex work, and then his cousin would rob them, and then later on they would split it, and then it turns out that they get a guy that was higher up in the government. I think you used a lot of first names, so it was hard for me to specify.
And all of them were pseudonyms, right? All those names are pseudonyms.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of Stewart right now.
Right.
And this guy was higher up, but he was, and so nothing happens with the guy in this, and what turns out to be his son. He's going out looking for male prostitutes with his son. Nothing, of course, happens to them, and they go back into the system. And also his cousin narcs on him.
Yeah.
Not narcs.
Snitches.
Yeah.
Pretty much snitches
And
on him.
it's just, there's so many situations that, well, it's just an endless circle of going back. It was mind blowing.
Yeah. So you interviewed over the course of over a decade.
Well, I was working with the organization.
Right, many people.
Yeah, so I was working at that organization for about 3.5 years, and then I kept up with other folks, kind of through social media or through other kind of ways, for a good part of about a decade or so. And then, the book came out earlier, last year, 2023. Yeah. So,
but I gotta know, right? It takes a lot of follow through. I have great ideas, and I'm known for my great ideas, but I have zero follow through or commitment to them. Maybe I'm just not passionate enough about them to see them to completion. But were there moments where you're like, this isn't worth it, or should I stop? Like, I have to imagine it was very difficult.
Absolutely. So the book actually came out of my dissertation, right?
Okay.
So I was doing my field work over at this organization for my dissertation, and dissertation writing is much different than book writing.
Sure.
So dissertation is fact, citation. You know what I mean? It's very written in a very formulaic way, whereas books, they're like, don't do that. No one wants to read fact after fact. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was about kind of flipping it, and how do I tell these stories and put these stories first? So like you said, I had to go back, kind of talk to some more people, but also had to go back and listen to a lot of the interviews that I had done, and kind of listen more for the stories rather than just the facts.
Sure.
So what were these folks really kind of going through? What did I remember as someone who was working with them? Because it wasn't just interviews, it was focus groups.
Well, and sure, like, how did you feel listening versus just the facts? Like,
yeah, and just also observing. So, the one chapter that talks a lot about the body and health, that didn't come out from me asking very targeted questions at the beginning of this research, but it was more from the kind of in-between conversations that I heard folks talking about. So like, if someone's arthritis was acting up, or if it was too hot that day, or if it was too cold that day, and their knees were hurting. And then it was kind of like me starting to probe, well, what is this about? And really about how prison really messes with the body.
Yeah.
That stuff like that just it packs such a punch. Some of the stuff with the bodily harm, we had a guy that was, as often happens, he develops a relationship with someone on the outside. I don't know if it was like letter writing, or I guess they're allowed to visit or something, but he was scared about going out because he had not had sex in 20 years. And he was one of I think the only person that really said to you, he's like, he's like, other people deal with this. I'll be honest, I'm scared to have sex.
Yeah. He was one of the most honest folks
never even consider something.
Who I talked to, and he had done time between New York and New Jersey. He also was the one who had the anecdote about when he first got incarcerated in New York State, and he went to the lunchroom to have lunch. He didn't know where to sit, and there was this old guy sitting there, and he sat with the old guy or older guy, and they're talking, having a fine conversation. And then when the old guy got up, some other guys came over and said, "Do you know who you just had lunch with?" And he said, "I have no idea." And it was Son of Sam.
Yes. Oh my, that was mind-blowing.
So he was like, he was a nice guy in the moment. You know what I mean? But
you said something along the lines that he can't judge a book by its cover.
Right. This guy.
Well, sort of to that point.
Oh my God.
I'm wondering if you went in when you were first doing these interviews, if you had any preconceived ideas or notions about who these people were, and if anything surprised you, or if there was any moment where you're like, I was being judgmental, or I prejudged the book by the cover. Did you have any moments like that?
Yeah, I think we all do, especially when you're going into the work with folks who've been on the inside. There are folks who might have a look, right? So one of the guys in the book who was a former outlaw motorcycle gang member, I mean, he was tatted from basically the top of his neck to every other part of his body. And, just to look at him, and he was a big guy, like, 6'3", 240 pounds. I mean, he was huge. And he was like a teddy bear, and he was really open, and he was really would talk to me, and we would have conversations even after group. So yeah, there was a lot of that, and especially, I'm in a space that is mostly black guys, and then we were talking about things like race, and here's this white dude who's a biker, and I'm like, and I was saying to myself, how is this conversation going to go? And he'd be really open to it, and like he said, he grew up in an area where there actually was a lot of black folks, and he wasn't racist, but he ended up joining an outlaw motorcycle gang, so he's like, yeah, there were certainly guys in the crew who've had certain feelings, but he's like, that really wasn't me. And so absolutely, there was that, or guys with maybe face tattoos at first. And I remember one time there was a guy, he was a younger guy, and he had a bunch of face tattoos. And I was just walking down the street of Newark, and someone tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and I saw all these face tattoos, and it kind of got me. And he was like, "Oh, Smiley from the organization." I said, "Oh yeah." So yeah, in that moment, I was like, "All right, who's tapping me on the shoulder?" Face full of tattoos,
Sure.
but he just wanted to say hi. So yeah, absolutely.
I wonder too. Sorry, this is now going off. We're gonna take lots of turns, I think.
Yeah, it's
today.
an ADD riddled show. Let's be honest.
Have you met anyone who wanted to get the tattoos removed, like especially if they got them inside? I would assume
Well, I mean, for just
some
jobs, looking for
might
jobs
want
and
to,
stuff like
yeah,
that.
jobs, whatever. It's a new chapter of your life, but that's expensive. Like,
Super expensive. Yeah. So yeah, there were guys who kind of talked about it. I mean, one of the guys who worked at the organization, who I call Mr. Dar in the book, he talked to a lot of it, especially the younger guys. There was some generational differences between tattoos
Yeah.
and where they were and placement. And he would say honestly, like, if you have a face tattoo, it's going to be harder to get you a job. It's not the end all be all, but what can we do? I know there are organizations, like there's a really great organization out in California, Homeboy Industries, and one of their big tasks is helping these guys who are former gang members to get their tattoos removed, especially either racist tattoos or facial tattoos,
God,
neck tattoos, hand tattoos, things like that. Yeah.
And on a broader level, it just seems to me that these for-profit halfway houses, that's the thing that I was so ignorant about and had no idea about. And to the extent where these guys are making so much money, first of all, I'm going all over the place here, but certainly we want to talk about the bed pay and the that's just a small example of the overall racket that are these places. But is there any state that has even approached the idea of giving tax tax breaks to people that would employ just out of the newly released prisoners in whatever capacity, not just always lifting boxes or stuff like that, particularly for the older guys. Is it just such an unpopular thing for taxpayers to think, oh, I'm just funding a guy that's getting out of the clink, and why should I be helping him when he did this? Is it just something that would never even be considered? Because it seems to me that would help significantly as far as getting these guys out of these fucking halfway houses, and also an incentive for the employer as well.
Sure. So, the crazy thing about our criminal justice system is that there's 51 different systems, right? Each state has its own system, plus the feds, and then within the feds, you have federal, and then you also have federal military, right? So, guys who are committing war crimes are also under a different jurisdiction. But there are federal bonding programs, so there are programs that the federal government might give certain employers, certain either tax breaks and things like that if you hire folks who have formerly incarcerated, or there's certain companies that will hire folks who are formerly incarcerated or might not ask. But as you brought up, right, the biggest pushback is, people saying, well, why are they getting a job? Why are they getting this opportunity? And I'm not getting this opportunity. It's one of the biggest reasons why in education in prisons and stuff ultimately was taken out in the mid-'90s, because you had politicians and others who were like, why are they getting a free education and my kid can't? And, the question that you really have to ask is, why isn't everybody getting a free education? Why isn't everybody being afforded these opportunities? So there are programs. Obama brought some stuff back, even Trump with his First Step Act. But people have to remember, even the First Step Act that Donald Trump introduced only adheres and applies to folks who are in the federal prison system, not in the state system, because, again, each state has its own rules and regulations around.
which state would you say has the most progressive system?
So two of the most right now, well, I would say, it follows voting lines, right?
Sure.
So blue states often are more progressive than red states. I would say New Jersey, New York, California are kind of some of the states leading the kind of progressive or reform efforts, but there are also some of the states, like California, one of the highest incarcerations of the country.
Right.
New Jersey has one of the highest racial disparities. New York, if you basically exclude New York City, New York State's prison population is super, super small. So, there is this kind of difference between downstate and upstate. So, so even the blue states have their faults, but I would say they're at least the states that are trying to acknowledge, and a lot of that has to do with who's in power. So, Governor Murphy in New Jersey has done a lot of reform since my time doing this research, and, you have to, salute him for that or give him his kudos. That really wasn't happening under the former governor, Chris Christie, who was a guy who was really good friends with a lot of these for-profit
I did not know that until you wrote that. That
Yeah.
was mind-blowing. And certainly something that I've not seen, at least in national media, discussed, perhaps in local in New Jersey. That blew my mind. And not to just harp on the halfway house, but it was, I was angry at myself for not knowing any of this stuff. But like, I guess if you could speak a little bit to how they have a reason why they actively discourage employment for these guys. I recall also the story that was this was more a parole issue. The story of I forget what his name was, but he was he could not find any place to live, which is always a big issue, as well as IDs. And he ended up living with his grandmother. The cops didn't like the fact that there were pit bulls. He ended up sneaking into his grandmother's, not sneaking in, an aide looked the other way, his grandmother's assisted living home. And then I think he finally went back into jail, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was a young guy, and he was living in a halfway house, and then moved into a shelter. He didn't like any of these situations because the shelter system. A lot of folks who have mental health issues. At the time, there was a huge bed bug outbreak in the metropolitan area, if you remember.
Triggering her.
I had them too.
I got them in prison. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was really not many places for this guy to live, and it was his aunt who allowed him to move in with her, and she had to make all these modifications to her home. So the parole officer was like, you need to have a landline phone, and no call forwarding, no three-way calling, no caller ID. So she had to go find this kind of simple phone, and then had to pay this monthly cost of having a phone. And then they came in, they broke it, she had to buy a new phone, and eventually the parole officer was like, you can't live with your aunt because she has these pit bulls. And so it was basically putting his aunt in this rock between a hard, rock and a hard place of, do I get rid of my dogs or, my nephew? And, he was like, I'll leave. And so he was living with his grandmother, and he was a young guy. So the way he explained it to me, there was the overnight guard at the assisted living was a woman, and he kind of charmed his way in.
I noted that. Yeah, I know. I was like, there's
and as long as he was out by 6, 7 a.m. before she went off duty, he was able to basically live there. But this was untenable, unsustainable type of living. And eventually, I learned that he had gone back to prison, and I lost contact with him after that.
You spoke a little bit about statistics in your book. Over 60% of people released from prison are rearrested within 3 years, and nearly half go back to jail or prison during that time, proving that prison is not acting as a deterrence or means of rehabilitation.
That's the big thing too.
Which,
right there.
that's the point, or that's how especially politicians reason things to the public. It's a deterrent or it's rehabilitation, then we'll send them back out and they've learned their lesson or they won't do the crime. But with so many people going back, what are we doing wrong, or what needs to happen to at least start making that number go down?
Sure. So, prisons are a failed experiment. When we think about the modern prison, they really only started in the late 18th, early 19th century. It was the Quakers kind of leading the way, saying we should get away from like drawing and quartering people or hanging them in public and doing all these kind of like atrocious things because someone stole a loaf of bread. And so they said if we separate people for a while and make them think about what they've done wrong and pray to God, right? So penitentiaries, penance, right? Ask for forgiveness, they will change their ways. But very early on, they learned that taking social creatures and putting them in small confined places and cutting them off from the world doesn't really aid in that assistance. So even from the beginnings, we knew that jails and prisons weren't going to have the formula for rehabilitation or to make people do things better. So one of the things I argue, and I am an abolitionist, is someone who's like, we have to think about a different system. We have to kind of throw this system out because it's not working, right? It's not doing what it says it's supposed to do. And like the statistic you read, that's the national average. In any other field, we would say scrap it. right?
Yeah.
If the Eagles, right? We just saw them lose last night. They might throw, the Cowboys, they might throw out the whole system off of one game, right? Imagine, we wouldn't see a sports team, we wouldn't see another system say, we're having these failing records year in and year out. Let's keep it going. So, it's
Basically, you're saying the system is an Eagles defense that has somehow forgotten how to tackle.
yeah.
Period. End of sentence.
Yeah.
Forgotten how to tackle.
Yeah.
Wow, it's amazing. But I love seeing them miserable. Now you've spoken of explain as far as possible solutions, and that's tough. Like cooling out periods. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did for this book was I was able to kind of tap into an area that I don't think that many folks who are doing this research have done, at least at that point, was talk about abolition from the perspective of folks who were actually experiencing the reentry in that moment. And so a lot of the kind of recommendations I give were ones that I didn't come up with, were ones that guys who were going through it came up with. So, they made this distinction between what they called separation and segregation. And they were saying, nobody is naive to the fact that there are things that happen in our society that can be heinous, that can be bone-chilling, and all of these things. But maybe for some folks, if we give them a separation period, so not strip them of their humanity like we do with prisons, which would segregate them from society, treat them like what we would do with, the food industry, animals and things like that, maybe that can be a way to kind of get folks to calm down, see what they've done wrong, or have things like credible messengers or other folks in the community who might be able to diffuse situations before they even happen. So we've seen a lot of these kind of pilot programs that have happened where former gang members or folks from the community who will go out and try to problem solve, because as we know, the streets talk. If something's going to happen, folks know. So have folks go in and be more proactive, because most of policing is retroactive. Police, come up when someone has already been shot. So how can we create systems where we can be more preventative, that take into consideration things like care, reducing harm, and building some type of accountability for folks rather than just say, let's lock everyone up.
What we're doing isn't working, and the for-profit nature in both jails and the halfway houses and this reentry stuff was again mind-blowing. That's why everyone needs to read this.
And also, communities are changing.
Yeah.
Completely. Like you were saying, the way policing is done, even just like community, neighborly kind of stuff. Like, I don't know my neighbors. I don't really want to know my neighbors or make eye contact or any of these things. And I wonder if that is a part of what will make it all better. You talk about, is it pronounced Wadi? Your community?
Wadi.
Wadi.
Yeah.
Again, not the real name.
No, not a real name. Yeah.
But he, like you said, had like a past, and then knew all these people in the community who were experiencing reentry. He's like, I'm one of the only people who can get these kids off the street. So like, how do we establish more of that? Like, how do we get people to be more involved in their community?
I think that there's a lot of folks who are willing to do that work, but not for free, right? I was on a community strategic board last year, and one of the things that I had suggested is that maybe we just need to have more community spaces, not drug, test centers, not places that people have to go and then feel like they're being surveilled, but just like a place to go. And someone on the call said, yeah, and we can get volunteers to run it. And I was like, and that's where it fails, right? Why don't we pay people good salaries, give them health care? Like, there's ways in which that we can make things happen and give people a sense of pride in that work, and really want folks to do that, because the work that he did was really like this fine line of being kind of tough and firm, but also compassionate and caring, right?
Yeah.
He didn't want to make these young men feel degraded or down, but also wanting to uplift them, but at the same time, give them a reality check. So, when a young man walks in with, I don't know, an 8-ball tattooed in the middle of his forehead, he had to say to him, like, listen, dude, like, this is going to prevent you from having some jobs, but it's not going to prevent you from having all jobs, right? So let's focus on the jobs you can have. You're probably not walking into, a Fortune 500 company with that on your head, maybe, but maybe that's not what you want either. And so there was that kind of that negotiation that he did, and he was an amazing man to do that work.
That and like you also, and obviously you've got some background with this, with regards to, and I believe your Wadi was sort of the name you gave him. He was basically he saw himself almost as your pseudo uncle, but he was friends with your dad.
Yeah.
Your dad was on his way to being a lawyer, but then what was it? Is heroin, I believe.
Yeah.
So much of this goes back to drugs.
Yeah.
And I was very, very ignorant. I mean, I was aware. I knew that the war on the drugs started with the Nixon administration. I didn't know it was specifically Rockefeller that was sort of the fire that started it all in New York.
Right.
That you taught me that. But I don't know. I'm sorry. As far as background and drugs overall, as far as the theme of the book is concerned, but also just with your dad.
Yeah. So, when you think about that generation of black baby boomers, right, and the things that they kind of experienced, right? Vietnam War, war on drugs, mass incarcerations, the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic. A lot of these guys really went through it.
Yeah.
And my dad was one who kind of got caught up in it. So he had gone to college on a football scholarship, graduated college, came back down to Newark where he's from, still lives today, and got addicted to heroin and had a quite literally a 40-year addiction.
45.
Yeah. It took him about 40 years. He's been clean now almost a decade, I'd say. And that's great. He just turned 70 on Christmas. So the fact that he's still alive and with us, I think
That's
it's kind
amazing.
of pretty crazy itself.
What does he think about this?
About the book?
Yeah.
I mean, he couldn't be prouder.
I was
You know what I
gonna
mean?
say,
But yeah, so Wadi was a childhood friend of his. Wadi kind of ran his own crew as a young man. But it was guys like Wadi who were the instrumental street characters who were telling my dad, go to school, stay in school, right? When it was
Interesting.
other street guys who wanted to beat up my dad for being in school, it was Wadi who, came to the rescue, or or it was Wadi who would smack my dad around if he wanted to play in the streets. But addiction, placed my dad in prison. He did time as well as an adult. But yeah, he introduced me to Wadi, and it was kind of off to the races after that with my research on this book.
And whether it be a joint or a brick of cocaine or anything in the middle, with the Rockefeller thing, it was sort of like a minimal incarceration. What was the actual phrase? You'd think with
Mandatory minimums.
Mandatory minimum.
Yeah.
Thank you. You'd think sober January would have made me better with this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just seems to me to be sort of like the sort of igniting thing, that when you look at so many of the anecdotes, brilliant ones that you have in this book, so many of them are drug related, and so many of them are fake. Or like, there's one poor bastard who was an addict, but he was a steward and he'd seen the world and he had a great life, but it got to the point where he was a storage unit for the overall dealer, but he got busted with the stuff in his house, so it's like possession with intent to sell, all that stuff, and he was fucked for 30 years, and it just did. I'm assuming you had probably your thoughts on the war on drugs didn't change much before starting this project as far as after, but I don't know, did you see things that you didn't see beforehand as far as really getting to know these guys?
Well, yeah, one of the guys who I spoke to, I think I called him Mac in the book, he talked a lot about how everybody in jail is addicted to something, right? And that was his takeaway. He said, you might sell coke, but you drink alcohol. You might sell heroin, but you do pills. And, there's this kind of overlap. And I think for a lot of the folks, going back to what I said earlier, particularly these guys who were baby boomers and even the Gen X guys who I spoke to, I didn't speak to that many millennials. There were some in there. But, drugs are a way of escape. They're a coping mechanism. So, a lot of these guys, I don't think, and I think it goes back to the old adage, I don't think anyone seeks out to become addicted to drugs, right? But things happen in life, traumas happen in life, pains happen in life. I look at it akin to a lot of the music that we hear today within hip hop, a subgenre called drill music, which, Eric Adams was trying to ban, and violence, misogyny, all this kind of stuff. But a lot of these young men, these Gen Zers, are talking about that they pop Percocets and other pills because it's the only way to cope, right? And if you're growing up in an area with a lot of violence and poverty and police harassment and inadequate housing and under, staffed schools, right? What else is there to do, right? If there's no other kind of outlet for these young men, and I really appreciate that a lot of them are so candid in the music, that this is something that they're dealing with, and where is the government? Where are our public officials stepping up to the plate to create other outlets? And the social safety net for many people to get off of drugs should not be going to prison. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no kidding.
Speaking of Gen Z and TikTok, we are now seeing prison talk We are seeing videos that people are making, people who have re-entered, who are then sharing videos about their experiences. Do you think this is a good thing, or is it sort of fetishizing, or not cheapening, but making it more just entertainment than reality?
I'm so grateful that you brought that up. So a colleague of mine, Jan Halderpoor, who's at Cal State Long Beach, and I are actually working on a book on this right now.
No kidding.
It's under contract with.
You're welcome. Segue to your new book.
NYU Press, and we're going through it, and we're TikTok, Instagram, and there's this really interesting kind of cultivation of this carved out area of content creators. So whether it's the kind of prison workout, prison cookbook, recalling stories of your time in prison, folks who cannot find employment in kind of the traditional means are starting to monetize the ways in which they can become content creators. And so I find that really fascinating.
Finally, it's serving a good purpose.
I do think that there is an interesting thing about the fetishizing of it. And, as someone who isn't system impacted in the way that, folks who might be doing this, I can have my own critique, but I also get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's companies that I've seen that, founded by folks who are formerly incarcerated, employ people who are formerly incarcerated. I think it's a great thing. But then, on the website, folks are kind of like standing there with like a mugshot as their bio, which I think sometimes has a little bit of a boutique-y kind of weird voyeurism to it.
Yeah.
But we also see this in television too. I mean, during the kind of peak of the pandemic, I was watching a show called Love During Lockup, which was like these men and women who are meeting folks on the inside. And, it's great that people are finding folks, but there was a certain level of depravity to the show because, I don't have the numbers, but it seemed like most of those relationships were failing, right? Or failing once someone got out or, someone was using someone else for something. And, but there's this kind of voyeurism as the watcher, just like kind of at some level hoping that it fails because that adds to the drama, right? And then, the way that they sensationalize going to commercial, coming back from commercial. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's something really interesting happening in the TikTok world and in the social media and in the digital spaces. And the last thing I'll say is it's an amazing way of how to archive and document what's happening because, for years, people only knew the outside of a prison facade. Now folks are seeing through what we call contraband phones or smartphones that are being smuggled in, what prison life looks like. And it's not glamorous.
Wasn't it recently an Atlanta prison? People were documenting the awful conditions there, and through these phones and through social media, were able to share it with the world, and that's how they got some reform within that prison. They got some things fixed.
I'm actually amazed that there are allowed phones in there.
Oh no, they're not. These are all contraband. These are all
Oh
contraband.
my God.
Yeah, these are all smuggled in contraband
Wow.
phones. Yeah.
The fact that now I'm just impressed that they're able to smuggle them in. That's a hard thing to smuggle in. They're thin, but they set off a lot of detectors, I would assume.
Yeah. Well, Kerry Blankinger, who's a formerly incarcerated investigative journalist, right? She's written a lot about the phones being smuggled in, and really interesting stuff. Guys have gone on and traded their Bitcoin through their smartphone. Some folks have enrolled in college programs, online college programs through their smart devices. Wow. So it's really interesting kind of, unpacking all of the various ways that these things can be done. And then she also was the one who broke when, in the height of the pandemic, how there were all of these overdoses around the country in jails and prisons. And, it was like, well, visits are not happening. So how are all these drugs and stuff getting in? So we know that it has to be through staff, corrections officers, others who are smuggling this stuff in.
Yeah.
I was asking myself this question almost throughout your book, and I don't know if I still have an answer of me if I was in this situation, but you've got a little more education on this matter than I do, and I'd be very interested in your answer. And you can also explain exactly his Cliff Notes version, I guess, of what I'm asking. But would you, if you were in the situation, rather take the halfway house or option or max out?
Yeah, I've actually thought about that a lot too. So for your viewers and listeners, there's something called maxing out, which you can do your entire stint in jail or prison, whatever, or you can take parole and get out earlier. Oftentimes, especially in New Jersey, at that point, most folks were going through the halfway houses. And so you have to ask yourself, if you get 10 years, but you're able to only do 8, and then do the last 2 years on the outside, what would you do? And I think the kind of rational brain goes, well, of course you don't want to be incarcerated. You don't want to have to live a life that might have to deal with survival and violence and all of these other kind of things. But, a lot of the guys who I talked to actually said that knowing what they know now, they would rather max out because they actually found that the halfway houses and the parole system actually put a lot more restrictions on what they were able to do. And in some cases, those guys actually went back to prison. So it almost felt like this kind of nefarious kind of trick that was played on them. Yeah.
Paying for the bed thing where, like, even if you leave, you're still paying for the bed if you found a job and can go, and, like, all that stuff. All these things that they are conditioned to, like, either get you out real quick or keep you in there if for whatever job reasons. It's mind-blowing, and you do such a great job of painting this picture about halfway houses that I had never known, that I really was thinking jail might be better. It just sounded absolutely, and also just like at the very least you're like sort of separated by some of the mentally ill people just yelling at each other, stuff like that, or gang members are separated and they're not there, like the safety aspect too.
Yeah.
It just sounded nightmarish.
Yeah, so New Jersey, like I said, every state has its own system, but this particular system in New Jersey for a while was really horrendous. I mean, Delaney Hall, which is now an ICE detention center, was an 1,100, almost a 1,200 bed halfway house. And, when you think about halfway houses as this space where you're supposed to come to get rehabilitation, how are you able to do that in a facility that actually had more beds than actual some of the prisons in the state of New Jersey? So, a lot of people were really critiquing this system, and it was led by this organization called Center for Community Education. They don't exist anymore. Their founder died, and then most of that company was sold off to Geo Group, which is the second largest for-profit prison system with Core Civic, which used to be CCA. Whatever the hell CCA used to stand for, but the Core Civic now, they rebranded because they were getting a lot of bad press as CCA. But yeah, so, there's this whole system where guys were like, this really sucks. And one thing that always stuck out with me was a couple of guys, but one guy in particular saying, I know how to jail, right? They had been in this system long enough. They knew the do's and don'ts of what jail or prison was. And that's not a brag. That's like I've been able to be conditioned or been able to adapt to this environment. Whereas the halfway house for a lot of these guys was something that was constantly in flux, right? Because there was this constant turnover of guys coming in and out of this system. And if you're living in kind of more of a dormitory style living situation, you are a bit more on edge than, say, even that two-person cell. And again, that's not to trivialize that living in a two-person cell that's very small is some kind of utopia of luxury, but it was something that they can control, whereas being in this kind of dorm was something they couldn't control.
Less variables.
Yeah, or I know some guys were telling me, like, there would be guys in state prison who were the problems, and then all of a sudden they'd see them at the halfway house and they say, well, how is this guy who has been a problem in the halfway house? And they realized that it was a kind of way to just have this churn. So the state prison knew that these guys would come back because they would inevitably get in trouble, but it kind of gave them a reprieve, which was this horrible kind of way of dealing with different situations.
Wild.
I know I would probably not last a day. Let's be honest. I would be dead before 24 hours. How long do you think Joe would last in prison? And what could she do to maybe perhaps extend her stay, or I should say life, rather than stay? I mean, you're a tiny gal.
I would be a prison influencer. I think that would
There you
be
go.
what I do.
There you go. One thing that I find really funny, and as a sociologist, I hate to say this, but in fact, one of the interesting things when you look at prisons between men and women, we really see stereotypes really magnified. So whereas men get really violent and territorial and stuff, women get kind of gossipy and friendly, and they so there's these really interesting, and there's folks who I've know written on this, like these kind of mother-daughter relationships that kind of form, especially with older women who take on the role of mothering, because a lot of the women who end up in prison have gone through sex trafficking, sexual assault, all types of horrible things where in fact many of them are victims themselves before they end up in prison. So we see these kind of ties. So overall, and this is a good thing, there's much less violence in women's prisons. So
I can hear her wheels cranking now. All right, now I can continue with it.
But again, that's not a plus that women's prisons are great and they're doing the right thing. There's certainly violence that happens in there as well.
To your point, I thought that one story of the woman that found out she was pregnant in prison and then being taken care of by the others in there. I thought that was very surprising. And
right. So
bad situation, obviously, but
but hers actually did have, I would say, one of the few kind of happier endings where she was able to reunite with her son later on in life. So, you know, as I say in the beginning of the book, you know, it's not a book that's going to make you. It's not a tight ribbon at the end of a happy-go-lucky, feel-good story. But I think it's important to tell these stories even if they don't have those happy endings.
Definitely.
Joe, I'll let you have the final question, but just real quick, I used to work at Lad Mags, your Maxims, your Stuffs, what have you, and of course all the letters that we would normally get, most of them would be from prison, and you're always amazed at how everyone really, when stuck in a situation like this, turns into MacGyver, and they can take something so little and turn it into so much like that. They taught us all these types of masturbation devices they had. It's called a surgical glove and maybe some gel and a toilet paper roll, guys. And check it out. It works at home as well as in prison. But also they would give us, there were so many great artists, and they were, for whatever reason, prisoners that were sending us this art, they were not allowed any type of colored pens or crayons or anything like that. So what they would do is they'd take the M&Ms and then use that for the various colors they would make. And they were gorgeous and stuff like that. And did anything come to mind on some ingenuity that people displayed when they had so little and were so regimented in prison that comes to mind?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, guys can do a lot of things. People adapt. So one of the things that is a big no-no in the jails and prisons I've been to is you can't have clickable pens because of the springs, because you do all types of machinery with that. I remember one of the backwards things, I used to go to a prison out in Pennsylvania, the women's prison, and I'd visit with folks out there, and you weren't allowed to have paper bill cash, but you were allowed to bring in quarters for the vending machines, and you could have up to $50 of quarters in a plastic bag.
That feels more dangerous.
I was going to say, that's a weapon.
Which I thought was, so there's always these kind of backwards rules that would happen. But yeah, and then at one point in the vending machine, they had gotten rid of all kind of potato chips that came in kind of silver, bags, baggies that were, it had to be in kind of paper bags or some other kind of plastic bags. I don't know. But I guess rolling it down, heating it, rolling it down, heating it around. I mean, I've seen guys, I've seen folks figure out how to, spark an electrical outlet to spark up a joint. All types of things. And I was like, dude, you're going to electrocute yourself. And he was like, no, I know what I'm doing. So really, some ingenuity. But again, you have to adapt, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
This was so delightful. As delightful as talking about this can be, but definitely check out the book. Any last minute plugs, promotions you'd like to share?
Yeah, sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at Uptown Castro. Castro with a K. You can visit my website, cjsmiley.com. And I have another book coming out this May called Defund Conversations Towards Abolition, coming out under Haymarket Press. So
please come back and join us for that. We would love that. Yeah, California Press for this one too. You guys, please read it. It is unbelievable. And I cannot thank you enough. Hey, you going to